the smiling man.
It was a cold autumn night when James left the office. The clock had struck midnight and the streets were eerily quiet. His footsteps echoed softly as he made his way through the deserted city, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. As he turned onto a dimly lit street, James noticed a figure in the distance. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow playing tricks on his mind. But as he drew nearer, he realized it was a man, dancing under the flickering streetlight. The man's movements were strange, almost hypnotic. He swayed and twirled with an odd grace, his arms flailing wildly as if he were conducting an invisible orchestra. But what unsettled James the most was the man's face. A wide, unnaturally wide grin stretched across his features, his eyes shining with an unsettling intensity. James slowed his pace, unable to tear his gaze away from the dancing figure. There was something off about him, something that sent a shiver down James's spine. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew he didn't want to stick around to find out. Taking a deep breath, James quickened his steps, trying to put some distance between himself and the dancing man. But no matter how fast he walked, the man seemed to keep pace, always just a few steps behind. A sense of unease settled over James as he realized the man was following him. He glanced back over his shoulder, his heart pounding in his chest. The man's grin had widened, his teeth glinting in the dim light. Feeling a surge of panic, James turned a corner, hoping to lose his pursuer in the maze of streets. But no matter which way he turned, the dancing man was always there, his grin never faltering. James felt a growing sense of dread as he realized he was being toyed with. The dancing man seemed to be enjoying the chase, relishing in James's fear. Desperate now, James broke into a run, his footsteps echoing loudly in the empty streets. He could hear the man's footsteps behind him, getting closer and closer with each passing second. It was as if the man was toying with him, deliberately keeping just out of reach. As James ran, his mind raced with questions. Who was this man? What did he want? And most importantly, how could James escape? Finally, James reached his apartment building, relief flooding through him. He fumbled with his keys, his hand shaking with fear. The dancing man was just a few yards behind him now, his grin wider than ever. With a final, desperate twist of the key, James flung open the door and stumbled inside. He slammed the door shut behind him, leaning against it with his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, there was silence. James's breath came in ragged gasps as he listened for any sign of the man outside. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no laughter, nothing but the sound of his own racing heart. Slowly, James pushed himself away from the door and staggered into his apartment. He locked the door behind him, double-checking to make sure it was secure. Only then did he allow himself to breathe a sigh of relief. But even as he collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion washing over him, James couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The memory of the dancing man's wide grin haunted him, a constant reminder that he was not safe, not truly safe. Days passed, and James tried to convince himself that it had all been a hallucination, a trick of the mind after a long day at work. But deep down, he knew the truth. The dancing man was real, and he was out there, somewhere, waiting. Night after night, James lay awake in bed, listening for any sound that might indicate the man's return. But the nights remained quiet, the only sounds being the normal noises of the city. Weeks turned into months, and James slowly began to relax, convinced that the dancing man had moved on to torment someone else. He even started taking walks at night again, though he always made sure to stick to well-lit streets and avoid any alleys or dark corners. But one night, as James walked home from a late dinner with friends, he heard a familiar sound, the sound of footsteps behind him, keeping pace with his own. His heart skipped a beat as he glanced over his shoulder, dread knotting in his stomach. And there he was, the smiling man, his grin wider and more sinister than ever. James's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. The dancing man had never left. He had just been waiting, biding his time until he could strike again. With a surge of adrenaline, James broke into a run, his footsteps echoing in the empty streets. But no matter how fast he ran, the smiling man was always just a few steps behind, his grin never faltering. As James reached his apartment building, he knew he had to think fast. He couldn't let the smiling man follow him inside, couldn't let him into his sanctuary. With a burst of speed, James sprinted up the stairs to his apartment, the smiling man hot on his heels. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking with fear and adrenaline. But this time, he didn't hesitate. He flung the door open and darted inside, slamming it shut behind him. For a moment, there was silence. James leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath. But then he heard it, the sound of laughter, low and chilling, coming from the other side of the door. The smiling man's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "See you soon," he whispered, his words sending a shiver down James's spine. And then, just as quickly as he had come, the smiling man was gone, leaving James alone in his apartment, shaken and terrified. From that night on, James never walked home alone again. He always made sure to have someone with him, to watch his back and keep the smiling man at bay. But no matter how hard he tried to forget, the memory of that wide, unsettling grin haunted him, a constant reminder that some nightmares never truly end. As time went by, James's encounter with the smiling man became a distant but vivid memory. He moved on with his life, surrounded himself with friends and family, and tried to put the terror of that night behind him. Years passed without any sign of the smiling man. James convinced himself that he had finally escaped the grasp of that malevolent presence, that perhaps it had all been a bizarre and isolated incident. But deep down, a part of him remained wary, always looking over his shoulder, always half expecting to see that wide grin lurking in the shadows. Then, one chilly autumn evening, James received a package in the mail. It was a small, nondescript box with no return address. Curiosity piqued, he opened it cautiously. Inside, nestled among layers of tissue paper, was a porcelain mask, a mask with a wide, unnaturally wide grin stretched across its features. James's blood ran cold as he realized what it was, a replica of the smiling man's face. A sense of dread washed over him as he stared at the mask, his mind racing with questions. How had the smiling man found him? What did he want this time? And then, as if in answer to his unspoken questions, James heard a sound, a soft, haunting melody drifting through the air. It was the same tune the smiling man had danced to that fateful night, a tune that had long haunted James's nightmares. With trembling hands, James placed the mask back in the box and sealed it shut. He knew then that the smiling man had never truly left, that he had merely been biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. But James was no longer the scared, helpless man he had been that night. He was stronger now, more determined. He refused to let the smiling man's terror consume him once more. Gathering his courage, James walked to the window and looked out at the city below. The night was quiet, the streets empty, but somewhere out there, he knew, the smiling man was watching, waiting. With a steely resolve, James made a decision. He would not be a victim again. He would face the smiling man head on, confront his fears, and put an end to the nightmare once and for all. And as he stood there, bathed in the soft glow of the moon, James whispered to himself, "I will not let you in. I will not let fear rule my life. You may be out there, smiling and waiting, but I am ready for you. I will find you, and I will make sure you never haunt another soul again." With that, James turned away from the window, his heart filled with determination. The smiling man may have been a relentless nightmare, but James was ready to face him, to reclaim his life and his peace of mind. And so, the battle between James and the smiling man continued, a never-ending struggle between fear and courage, darkness and light. But no matter how long the night may seem, James knew that dawn would eventually come, and with it, the promise of a new beginning. Thank you for joining us on this thrilling journey through the tale of the smiling man. Until we meet again, may your path be illuminated by the light of courage and truth.